Hey everyone, how you doing today? Wazoo here, and this is a video on creating your own full stack application using Spring Boot for the back end, and then Vite and some Backbone.js for the front end. Yeah, I know. The year is 2023, and I'm talking about Backbone.js. I know. But stay with me. This will be really cool. What you see here is the home page of Vite. So Vite is the next generation. It bills itself as the next generation of front-end tooling. But essentially, it's a souped-up version of Webpack. Or if you want to think of it a different way, I believe it takes components and inspiration. That's a better way of putting it. Inspiration from Rollup. So if you've used Rollup before, then it works along the same kind of principles instead of the quote-unquote heavier feeling Webpack. But it's an easy to install, easy to work with bundler. We just get it set up and running, and then away we go. Yeah. So we're going to be building a super small API with our Spring Boot backend, and like I said, we'll be bundling in some Backbone.js views and routers. And why did I choose Backbone? Well, I have still come across apps in 2023 written with Backbone, so it's not quite dead yet. And if you understand Backbone, I think one of the benefits of using Backbone is that it really helps you, it really helped me put into a context of the model view controller pattern that dominates front-end web development. Server-side maybe, but for the most part, front-end development is still very MVC based. And I found that when I started web development ages ago, I don't want to say when Backbone was the new thing because it was even before Backbone, but we'll put that aside. When I first learned about JavaScript frameworks, when they were finally starting to show up on the scene, we had jQuery, which was a library, not really a framework. But then after that came things like Backbone and Underscore and things like that. And I found that learning Backbone really helped me create a mental model in my head as to how the separation between view, model, and controller really works in an application. And that still carries through to other frameworks that we use today. So if you can make use of Backbone, then you can pretty much just drop in and run ahead with Angular, AngularJS, or Angular 15, whatever the version is now, and React. So yeah, I think it's a great learning tool. If you're still new to front-end development, then I still think it's worth your while, at least playing around with Backbone. So here I am on vite.js.dev. This is the sort of main site for Vite, as I said before, but we will be starting our project as usual at start.spring.io. So let's switch over to night mode, make it a little bit more visible there. Okay, so I'm going to be picking Maven again. Java, of course. We'll be using 3.0.1 on this, basically the latest version, whatever release that will be. And we will just call this Spring Boot 3 Backbone Demo. Okay, and so we'll leave it as a jar. We'll leave Java 17. And for dependencies, we'll use the dev tools, and then we'll add Lombok, and then we'll add Spring Web, and then we'll add Spring Data. We won't really be using data, but let's just put it all in there because that's kind of what we normally use for a backend anyways. And Thymeleaf, even though we're not using Thymeleaf, but it helps. Okay, so go ahead and hit that generate button. Download the zip file, extract it to your favorite place on your hard drive, and open it in your favorite editor. Okay, hopefully that's legible. I've got the project open in front of me with IntelliJ, but you can use, like I said, you can use your favorite editor, and you'll notice that the project setup is the same as every other project that you generate from start.spring.io. Okay, so I've already done a tutorial I'll link it in the description as well as put a link for it in right here in this video. But we've already done a small, the first bit of work for this already in a project called packaging a React application in Spring Boot. So we're going to be using some of the same code and then just adding in the Backbone bits. So in your application profiles, or not profiles, application properties, we're going to be setting up the same server properties that I've normally been doing in all of my videos here so far. But I will cut and paste them from another project. Okay, so just to basically run down these settings like we've done in the past, we're setting our server port to be 8080, and we are defining our data source properties. We're going to be using a file database, and again, we're not actually going to be storing anything in this database in this application, but it's just kind of a nice to have. That way, when you want to build upon what we're about to build today, then you can put in your own data and you're all set to go. We're enabling our H2 console settings. We're going to be, even though we're not really using Thymeleaf, I'm just going to leave the cache to be false. And you'll see why in shortly. And then I've just got our usual JPA hibernate and show SQL settings. And this one, in case you've forgotten, this one helps us make sure that all of the requests to our server on port 8080 get redirected to this, to our main index application, or not index application, our main index route. So we're going to generate that now. So in the Java com.example.springboot3 backbone demo folder, let's go ahead and create a new package, and we'll call it controllers. And then inside that, we'll create a new Java class and call it spa controller. Okay. And then we're going to be using the controller annotation. And then we are going to be using the get mapping helper annotation with a value of /*/ / open squiggly path, comma, basically some regex to make sure that all requests are redirected to the index, the main index here. So we want to do a forward. So we want to forward everything over to our root. Okay, and that's all we need. So we can, there's nothing to see if we get started with this right now. So another thing we're going to do is we are going to be making, while we're in here in the server, we're going to be making a REST API controller. And all this is going to do is return a small JSON object of basically one property, a message that just says hello or hello world, whatever you want to call it. So within our controllers package here, let's go ahead and create a new one, another new package. We'll call it API. And then within that, another new package, and we'll call it V1. And then within that, let's create a new class, and we'll just call it hello controller. And this one will be annotated with the REST controller to signal that we're going to be returning data instead of a front end or a Thymeleaf piece. So then let's use a get mapping. Oh, right under REST controller, sorry, we should have a request mapping annotation of /API/v1. So everything beginning with /API v1 will get handled by this controller. And then we will call this one just /hello. And we will just return a string. Return just some JSON with some a single payload of message property, just saying hello world. And then we close it off. And that should be good. Okay. So we've now got our hello controller set up along with our main index. Oh, let's enable that. That always asks me every time. Okay, let's not hover that mouse. Okay, so that the server will start everything up. Everything should be starting up as per normal. And let's drop to the command line and let's open up terminal. So let's curl. Okay, so curl, and we'll just do an HTTP localhost 8080 API v1 hello, and we get our payload back, message hello world. Awesome. So that all works, and that's really all we have to do for this server piece right here. Yeah, nice and simple. So now we get to use our vite. Okay, so what we're going to do back on our command line, if I can find it again. Okay, here we go. So back on our command line, we are going to go to our, and then, oops, I always do that. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we are going to go to the CD, let's go into CD source main. Okay, and then at this level, which is where I normally create my JavaScript projects that I'm going to be bundling with Spring Boot. It's just a preference of mine, but it's an easier way I find, to sort of keep things contained and organized. So right now I am using NPM version 8.19.3, and I am using Node 18.13.0 for this video. I don't think the versions really matter very much, only when it comes to our Maven pom.xml file where we swap in some version numbers. But for the most part, this should work with anything above Node 16 maybe. I haven't tried going down that far, but it should be fine with 16. So let's see. So first we want to do a npm create, if I can spell right, vite at latest, and then we'll just call it front end. And then it will go out and do its thing, and it'll ask us to select a framework, and we want to pick vanilla and JavaScript. So Vite will handle both JavaScript and TypeScript, but for this project we're going to be using JavaScript. Okay, easy peasy. So we just have to cd into the folder, cd front end, npm install. Okay, and then let's just go ahead and run the dev server. There's still, of course, lots of work to do, but we will at least show you the basic Vite generated application. So you'll see here that it'll display the what port it's available on, and it's localhost 5173. So let's see. I know I can control click, but okay. Localhost 5173. So hello Vite. And then on the default app, they've got a button that says count is 0, and you can just click on it and it'll increase the count, just to kind of demonstrate a little bit of interactivity on the sample demo site. Cool. So you should see that in your own application, in your own local environment, sorry. And let's go ahead and hit Control-C. And what we will do is we will then install the Backbone underscore and jQuery libraries. So npm install Backbone underscore jQuery, and then save this. So it will run out and do its thing. Hooray. That was pretty quick. And then what we need to do is we need to be able to configure Vite to basically work with the jQuery backbone and underscore dependencies. So we'll need one more library. So npm install at rollup / plugin inject, and then save dev. So it will go out and do its thing. And so Vite uses one of its helper files, which you don't you don't need it by default, but you will need it if you want to do any kind of customization, which we'll be doing, is it's similar to the webpack.config.js, only it's called the vite.config.js. So over here in the root of your front end folder, I forgot to sort of expand this and highlight what gets generated. So Vite, by default, the vanilla project, it will generate a gitignore file for you, a public folder for putting any assets, like static assets in it, and we'll be making use of that later. A small JavaScript file called counter, an index HTML, a JavaScript SVG file, another main, basically a main entry point in your JavaScript application, as well as the package files and the CSS. So in the package.json, if we open that up, we'll see that we're working with a module, and we have some script helper functions here already for working with Vite, and we've got our Backbone, jQuery, and underscore dependencies. So in this front end folder, let's go ahead and create a vite.config.js. Oops. And then what we want to do is we want to import define config from Vite, and then we want to import that inject package that we just imported. So rollup / plugin inject, and then we want to export a default define config. So it's basically another config file that we're exporting, similar to how Webpack does it. And we have a plugins array, and so we're going to be opening that up, and we are going to be injecting the $sign for jQuery. So this part is very similar to the dependencies injection in the webpack.config.js, as well as so we have jQuery. Is jQuery the provide plugin from webpack.js, and then we want to handle the underscore and alias it to underscore, and then Backbone, we want to alias that to Backbone. Okay, perfect. So this is all good, fine and dandy. So now it shouldn't give us any issue when we want to start it up. Let me just get back to our window there. That's not it. There we go. So if we do npm run dev, it will start the dev server, as well as take into consideration our updated vite.config.js. So if we go back to the website or the web page and refresh, we won't see any difference because we're still reading everything from main.js. So you can see here that we've got, I'll just expand this a little bit here. You can see that we've got our just a standard little bit of JavaScript to populate an element on the index.html page within the app div, and just put in that SVG file I pointed out, along with a link to the JavaScript docs, as well as displaying the counter and the button. So let's go ahead and delete all this. We'll leave the style.css. And then what we will do is we will import $ from jQuery. We'll import underscore from underscore. And we will import Backbone from Backbone. And then what we'll be doing is, this is another kind of wriggle or workaround that needs to be done in an app like this. When you're working with jQuery and some of the newer bundlers, we have to manually attach the jQuery $ to the window. And we have to do the same thing for the underscore library. So just to prove that everything loaded up correctly, what I usually do is I just console log them out. So console log out underscore, oops. Oh my goodness, my fingers. And then console log out jQuery, just for fun. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with that. Let's go back to our, so we can just leave this server running and it will just keep reloading as whenever we make any updates to our main.js. I think it'll reload whenever we add or update anything in this folder structure. So let's go back to our JavaScript, or our web browser, sorry. So let's open up the developer tools, and we can see that we now have the underscore and jQuery libraries being displayed here in the console log. So that looks good. Okay, so let's comment those out. We no longer need those. And then Backbone works from using what's called a router, which was new back then, but nowadays every framework has the concept of a router. So we are going to be extending the Backbone router into our own object. So we'll just call this, we'll be importing, let's just call it app router from /router, which we'll create in a few minutes here. And so then what we'll use, we'll reference the Backbone object here and the jQuery. Basically, it's the when Backbone is finished loading, which relies on jQuery and underscore as dependencies of Backbone. So when all three libraries have finished loading, then it fires a ready event similar to jQuery's ready event. And so this is how we reference it. So backbone.$, and then let's put in a console log. Just call it front end entry point. Nice. And what we will do is we will initialize that router. So new app router. And then all Backbone apps, or at least all the ones I've worked with, have had to manually call backbone.history.start. And that just kicks things off and gets things rolling in our Backbone application. Okay, so let's go back into our front-end folder and let's create that new file called, I'm just going to call it router.js, but you know what, I'll call it approuter.js just to be consistent with what we're naming there. And then what we want to do is we want to import Backbone from Backbone. Pretty cool. And then what we've got is a router options object that we're going to be putting together. So we're going to be defining some routes for our application. We won't put anything in there for now. So what we'll do is we'll do a star action. So basically means the default, every route that isn't handled will fall down to this star action handler. And we will just call this the default route. It will call a function called the default route. Okay. So the default route, we can create an arrow function, and basically we can just console log default route. Okay, and then that all looks good. And then we want to export this object using export default backbone.router.extend, and then pass in the options. So you know what, we can just call it options. Let's just call this object options. Okay, so it will then take in this configuration for our app router, feed it, and it'll extend the Backbone router object and export it from this module back into the main.js module that we are then calling right here for app router. So we just have to rename that to app.router. There. So now let's go back into our browser, and everything should have refreshed for us. And we see here, we see our console log. Oops. Our console log of front-end entry point and default route. So we are on a really good time now. Okay. So we've got a default route path defined here. So now what we are going to do is we are going to create a view to handle that default route. So what we're going to be doing is back at the top in our import section, let's go ahead and let's define an import default view from, and then we'll call this /views default.view. And then right underneath the console log where we've got default route, let's go ahead and let's just new default view. So what we're going to need to do is now create a folder called views. So within our front end folder again, let's create a new one, a new directory called views. And let's go ahead and create a new file and call it default.view.js. The core of Backbone is through the router, as we've sort of been dabbling with already. And like I said, it works pretty much as every router has since the Backbone library was introduced. So now views are another Backbone object, and it contains the glue between the glue is the wrong description. It creates a representation of the data that we're working with on our front end, as well as any communication with other controllers if necessary. So let's go ahead and create our basic view, and I'll walk through it as we create this thing. So again, we want to import Backbone from Backbone. We're going to experiment later with just removing that import statement since we've defined it in the vite.config, but for completion, I want to leave it in there now, just so I don't get any weird errors maybe. And then what we're going to have is another options object that we'll be creating all of our stuff in for this view. So the main element, or each view has an element that it can attach itself to, which should be an element that exists in your HTML markup file. So we are going to be using a root, an element called with an ID of root, which we'll update here shortly. And so each view has an initialize function. And what we want to do is we want to create a new Backbone model. So views and models work together in conjunction. So the models handle, as they do on the server side, the models handle sort of the data layer, quote unquote data layer of your front end. So when you have basic properties, like say for users or for products, or basic model data that you want to display, then the idea is that you set them up within models and then render them in the views, which will then make use of your HTML templates to paint everything at the end of the day into the browser. So I'll walk through that as we get to this. So each view comes with its own model, loose model reference that we can make use of. So we'll just be using this.model, and we'll say new Backbone.model, and we can initialize a Backbone model with some default attributes, or some attributes that we're going to be using, sorry. So the first one we're going to use is one called message, and by default it will just be hello world. We can even just call it hello, just so we're not confusing things with the server that we just put together, the server function that we just put together. And then another one after message will be count of 0. So the idea of this default page, maybe I better explain that, is that we're going to display just a basic this basic message text here along with a count. And then we're going to have, similar to the view demo that I demonstrated, we're going to have a little button, and then every time you push the button, it'll update that count value. Okay, so another property of the views is, or every Backbone object in the library, is that they have a event listening function called listen to. And this allows you to set up the a link between an object you want to listen to, the name of the event you're listening for, and then what function to fire once that event comes in. So we are going to be using a view. We're going to be attaching the listen to this view, and we're going to be listening to this.model, and we're going to be listening for any change event. So whenever these attributes of this model get changed, then what we're going to be doing is calling the render method of this view. And then finally, we are going to be calling this.render. So the render method is a default method of every Backbone view, which handles all of the painting of any markup that you want to display to the browser. Okay, so let's then every view has an events hash or events object. We'll leave this blank for now, but this is where we'll fill in our event for the button click. And we'll finally do a render call. So we're going to be using a render function, and every render function, or what I've always done, is returned this. That way you can chain together render functions whenever you need to. We won't need to for this project, but it's kind of a behavior I've always done in every Backbone project. So there we go. So what we're going to be doing is we are going to be loading HTML from a template, and then using underscore to convert that to a string, and then passing that into this render function. So we are going to be that EL, the $EL element that we defined back in the root option here, or back at the top of the options object, is we're going to be referencing that, and we are going to be passing in all of our template string value that we're going to be loading from our template. That's how it will paint to the browser and make everything look pretty. So what we want to do is we want to const template. So this will be a string of HTML that we are going to be pulling from our an HTML template. So we are going to be creating a custom method, and we are going to be calling it templateFromUrl, and the URL we're going to be using is default HTML. And this is sort of a mechanism I came up with for this demo for loading up HTML files in Backbone. Okay, so you'll notice that we are using a URL of /default.html, and so remember back in when this project, or when Vite put our project together, it created a public folder. So when you have static assets like CSS or images, then they usually go into the public folder, and then you can access them with just a slash and then the file name. So for example, vite.svg is referenced by /vite.svg. So we want to create a default HTML file, since this is what we are referencing here. So let's go into the public folder, create a new file, and we'll just call it public.html. And this is going to be very basic right now. We're just going to be creating a div, and an h1, it will contain, you know what, right now, that's where our message will be coming out, but let's leave that for the moment. And let's just put a p tag in there, and this is a default view. And we'll drop in our button code here. It won't do anything, but we'll set it up right now. The button has been clicked an X amount of times. So let's just create that text there, and then let's create a button, and we'll call it click me. And then we will create a path, a route to a about page. So we just need an href, and then the way we reference our internal router from the app is we do a hashtag / and then the route name that we want to go to. So here we want to go to the about page. So we'll create that shortly, but let's finish off this view. So back in the default view, we've got our render function, And then all we need to do is just export this just like we did the router. So we can export default Backbone.view, extend, and then options. That's what I called it, options. Okay. And then in our root folder of the front end, let's go into that index.html file here, and let's just rename this id equals app to id equals root. And that's all we need to do. So it should reload, and let's go into it. And oh yeah, we didn't define the function templateFromUrl. How silly of me. Okay, so in the root folder again, in the front end folder, sorry, let's create a new file, and we'll just call it utils.js. A nice and generic utils name. And then what we're going to do is we're going to import from underscore, import underscore from underscore. Okay, so let's create a small function, export const template from URL, and we will create this as an async method. When we're given a URL, what are we going to do with it? We are going to see, so let's see, let template HTML equals an empty string. So if we've already retrieved this string before, so if cache URL, I guess we can just, yep, cache URL, then template HTML equals cache URL. Okay, so otherwise, what we want to do is we want to make use of the fetch API. So let's do a template HTML equals await fetch. We want to fetch the given URL, and then we want to take the response. Since it returns a promise object, we want to take the response, and what we want to do is return the response text method instead of the default, which is usually JSON, but for our purposes, we want to return any string, any data coming back from a template file as a string that we can work with as text. So then we have another then handler. So then HTML, and what we want to do is we want to return the HTML, and this will get assigned into template.html here. And then if there's an error, let's go ahead and just catch that. So catch any error, and we'll just display a console error log. Okay, easy peasy. And then what we'll do is we will assign cache URL to be equal to oops, it would help if I could spell, equal to template HTML. And then up here, we will just have a let cache equals, we'll just create a empty object that we will be playing with during the lifetime of our. Okay, so at the end of the day, no matter which case we go into, if it exists or if we're waiting for it to show up, we'll be working with template HTML. So we will be using a compiled equals template HTML. So we are using a underscore method called template, which works with a string of template markup. And so it will compile that for us. Basically, it's not really compiling. It's just the name of the variable. We can call it anything we want. We can call it output. Let's call it output. Maybe that's easier to follow. So let's call it output. Const output equals the underscore dot template function, passing in our template HTML. And then we are going to be returning that. So return output. So let's go back into our view, and let's import template from URL from utils. Okay, so that should all load up and it should refresh automatically. So let's go back into the front end and we get a 404, default HTML not found. Okay, I didn't realize that I named this file public.html, so make sure it's named default.html. And then let's go ahead and refresh. And here we go. We got our templated HTML coming out. This is a default view. The button has been clicked blank times. We haven't put anything in there. We've got a button that does nothing when we click it. And we've got a link to an about screen or about page. And it won't do anything because we don't have a handler for the about, so it'll just return back to our default view. So let's quickly go ahead and create that about view right now. So let's go back into our application here, and in the router, let's just create a another entry above the action. Everything has to be above action. Action has to be the last. Actually, no, it won't matter because it's just an object. It's not an array. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a about route, and we will call it the handler will just be named about route. So about route will take in, it will be an arrow function, and we will just trigger a new about view, which means we have to import an about view from .views.about.view, which doesn't exist. So let's go ahead in the views folder and let's create a new file here, and we will call it about.view.js. And for the most part, it will look exactly like the default view. So we will import Backbone from Backbone. Let's import underscore from underscore. And then let's import template from URL from dot slash utils. Okay, and then let's just call this our const options again. And we wanted to use the EL of root, hashtag root again. And then we've got an initialize function. And again, we want to make the same binding to the model attached to this view, to this about view. So we'll use this dot model equals new backbone dot model, and we won't put any attributes in it right now, but we'll update that shortly. And we'll use this listen to again to create a event listener between this dot model and the change event, and it will trigger the this dot render event, or this dot render function. Okay, and then we will call this dot render, and then in the render function here, we will define it as another async function, just as we did in the default, and we will load up the template equals await template from URL, and we will be using /about.html, and then this $EL, where you're going to call the HTML function on that element and pass in this template HTML string. And I believe that's all we need to do. And then we just need to export this. Export default backbone.view.extend, and then options. Cool. So now we just need a about.html. So in the public folder, let's go ahead and create a file called about.html, and it will be just as small as the default one. So div, and we'll give this a header of about so that we know we're on a different template. And within a p tag, we'll just use this is an about page for the app. And then we'll be adding in our message from the server. So this is a message from the server. And within some block quotes, we'll put in our message. We'll fill that in shortly. And then we'll have an href equals / to get us back to the home page or default page. So it should restart for us. And okay, so now we've got our about screen here. Let's blow this up a little more. Okay, so we've got our about. This is an about for the app. This is a message from the server, which we'll fill in, and then a link back to home. So let's click that link and we go to the home view. And this is our default view. This button has been clicked times, and then we've got a button. So let's go back into our default view and let's go ahead and create that button handler. So back in our default view file, you'll remember that we've got this empty events object. So let's go ahead and we will create a event listener of the click function from our button element. So we can just use click button. And then whenever we click the button, it will trigger the onClick function. So let's create an onClick function. And all we want to do here is we want to retrieve the current count value from the model that's attached to this view, and then we want to increment it by 1, and then set that count attribute back to the model, which will then trigger the render method thanks to our listen_to method or listen_to handler that we set up in the initialize function. So let's define a variable called temp, and we will make it to this .model get, and then we want to get the count attribute. So we specify when we're retrieving the value of a model from Backbone, we need to specify the string name of that attribute. So now we've got the temp, now we've got the count value stored in temp. So let's increase the temp value by 1. And then let's go ahead and this .model and then set. And then set takes in an object to update the properties or the attributes, within that model. So we want to update the count attribute and we want to update it by the temp value. So it will go ahead and call that set value, which will then trigger a change event, which because of our listener here will then trigger a render function. So then it'll go back down to our render and it will display again to the screen to update. So let's go ahead and let's console log that temp value just to prove that we are handling the click value. So temp value of temp. And then let's go ahead and go back into our app. And then let's start clicking the button, and we can see in our console logs temp value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever. But we are not seeing it in the view in the front end. We are updating the data properly, but we're not pulling it out of that model and putting it into our view. So let's go back into our function here. And what we want to do is that underscore template function that we call on the template string also accepts a objects object, or not an objects object, it accepts a JavaScript object which can be used to populate the data that we want with the parameters that we want to fill in the front end. Let's just go ahead and do it and we'll walk through it and I'll show you. So what we can do is we can pass in this model to JSON. So we can, this is a helper function within each Backbone model, which will convert the model attributes to a JSON object, and which we can then work with within templateFromUrl. So let's go back into our templateFromUrl function in the utils.js, and let's accept a data parameter, and by default it'll be an empty object. And all we need to do is down in our return output, we want to, before it was like this, so all we need to do now is return output and then pass in any data object that is passed into this function. So then the underscore template method will make use, it will work with that data object and fill in the appropriate variables that are in the markup. So what do those variables look like? Well, let's go back into our default HTML, and right here before clicked in times, or right after clicked in times, we can use the open arrow, %, and then equals count, and then close it off with %, angle bracket, end angle bracket. So what that'll do is it's similar to the EJS style of view syntax, if you've ever used that in the Node world. But if not, it's also very similar to the one of the template markup languages used for Ruby on Rails, called HBS, handlebars. No, not handlebars. Is it ERB? I think it's ERB. ERB files. So it also uses this kind of syntax where we've got the percentage equals, and then the variable we're trying to access, and then we're ending it off with % angle bracket. So let's go back into, and we also have that message. So within the H1 tags, let's do the same thing. Angle bracket % equals message, and then % angle bracket to close it off. So let's go back into our browser, and we've got hello. This is a default view. This button has been clicked 0 times. And now when we click the button, it updates the count variable. Very cool. Okay, and this is our hello text, which is from our, which is the message parameter from our object. So like I said, we also want to make use of that API controller that we put into our Java Spring Boot server back in the intro, or back in the opener of this application. So what I want to do is when we go to the About page, I want to display the message from the server here. So let's go back into the About view, and what I want to do is I want to make another fetch call to that API method, or API handler. And I'll just do this right before the render. So let's call this, I just called it server. Kind of a terrible function name, but you get the point. You can call it whatever you want. So server function, and then what we're going to do is we are going to be using the fetch call, and we're going to be using /API/v1/hello. And remember, it returns a object, a JSON object. So we want to work with the response, and we want to call the JSON function on the response. So then we go back into and then so the output of the JSON object, or JSON function, gets passed as the data coming into this method. So we want to do, here's another wrinkle for Backbone apps, is that sometimes we get lost in the context. The JavaScript gets lost in the context, and so this doesn't always equal the this that we want it to. So we want to reference the view this, which we will store in just a basic variable called self. It can be anything we want. It's a goofy workaround, but it's kind of necessary when you're working with Backbone applications. So it's no different than, like, normally we would call this.model.set. We want to set the message variable to be data.message. So use the message payload of the data coming back. So this won't work because when we finally get into the variable this won't be recognizable by Java, won't be associated with the this from this view. So we'll have to just use our saved self variable right above here before we started the fetch. Again, it's goofy. It's another kind of wrinkle of Backbone that everyone had to deal with, but it's not really that terrible. Okay, And in the, again, down in the render method in this template from URL, we want to pass in this.model.toJSON, just like we did in the default view. So it's going to update the model with our message, and then it's going to throw it into the template from URL function, and then it should display no problem. So everything looks okay. And let's see. Okay, so it didn't work. It did work, sorry, but it's not returning what we want. Because it's thinking right now, it's thinking that it needs to be served from the front end. It doesn't realize that request going from request going to /API is going to be referencing. We want to reference our Backbone, or not our Backbone, our Spring Boot server, not our Backbone front end. So there's an easy workaround for that. So back in our vite.config.js, remember how we just had the plugins section here? Well, now we're going to set up a server proxy configuration to just reference our Spring Boot server. So if we create a server object and then a proxy, and then so everything starting with /API, we want to make the target equal to our localhost 8080. And then we want to change origin, and our secure flag is going to be set to false because we're not using HTTPS. And then I think that's it. So we get a 500 error from the GET request because I bet you we didn't turn the server on. So let's go back into our IDE and let's turn on the Java Spring Boot server. Should have thought of that before, but I guess it's a good reminder. Okay, so the server looks like it's up and running. Let's go back here and refresh the page. And oh yeah, we didn't update the template. Okay, so back in our about.html, remember how we have the empty block quotes here. So what we want to do is we just want to use the angle bracket %= message. And then let's call it something different. Okay, so message here. And oh yeah, so in the about.js, we've got a an empty model in the initialize function. So all we want to do is we want to update that with an attribute called message, and just make it an empty string right now. Okay. And here we go, hello world from our server. Now that is really, really, really cool. So we've, at the end of the day, we've got a simple Backbone application in the front end for handling front end work. We've got different views referencing different models between them. We can navigate between the two with a simple ahref. We can listen to and bind to different events within each view, such as a button click, and we can extract data from our server side. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to be updating the pom.xml file with the necessary, let's stop the server here. I'm going to update it with the same markup that we went through in the packaging your React app with Spring Boot. And that way when we I'm just going to cut and paste it in here. It'll be in the source code for this application, but then that way when you package it yourself, it will go ahead and bundle up our JavaScript application where it needs to be, and you can serve it right from Spring Boot. So in the plugins section, we are going to be pasting in a couple of plugins. So I'll go through them quickly here now. So in our pom.js, in the root of our Spring Boot server here, let's go down until we're into this build plugin section. So after this first plugin, I'm going to be cutting and pasting another couple of plugins. So let's go through them right now quickly here. So we already did the Maven one. Okay, so we're going to be referencing a artifact from Maven called com.github.irslet. And this helps build, helps work with any kind of JavaScript and NPM, Node and NPM that you want to use in your application. So you're probably going to need it if you're using Node and NPM. So what it's going to do is it's first going to install Node and NPM. So it's going to be installing the 18.13.0 version of Node and the 8.19.3 version of NPM. And again, that's all we did at the beginning of the video was just npm-v and nvm list. I'm using nvm, but if you've got Node, then node-v will also return it. And then once that's done, once that's installed, we'll be using npm install. And so what this will do is, of course, this will pull down all of our npm dependencies. So Backbone, jQuery underscore, everything else. And then finally, it will be calling npm build, which will be calling the npm build task from vite, which will package up all of our JavaScript app together, and it'll put it into a folder called dist. And then what we want to do is, we are defining that our front end work is in our JavaScript folder is in the source/main/frontend folder. And then finally, we're using the Maven resources plugin to copy all of those resources from the source main frontend dist.folder into target classes.static, which is where the front end CSS and JavaScript needs to go for every Maven built Java application. So let's go ahead and go back to our command line. Let's quickly run that right now. Let's Control V, let's stop this. Okay, so let's type in mvnw package. Oops. We are not in the root. Wait, so we'll go back in the front end and let's type in npm run build, just to show you what it looks like. So vite will do its thing. It'll build everything and put it within the dist folder right there that we see. So let's go back into the root of our project, and let's type in mvnw package. So it will go ahead and do its thing. As you see here, it's installing Node and npm. And so if you have it on your system, it will just reference what's available on your system. Otherwise, it will pull it down from Maven. And then it's calling vite build, as we see right here. It's made the dist folder, and it's copied them into where it needs to copy the resources. And then it's building the Spring Boot application, and now it's running the tests, which it does whenever you whenever you use the package. Okay. And then if we just type in java-jar target, it will go ahead and run it'll spin up this Spring Boot server. And then we can reference the app on port 8080. So let's go back into our browser here and let's do localhost port 8080. And ta-da, we get our JavaScript. We get our JavaScript application now coming through on the default port 8080. So we can click and it'll click as it was before. We can go to the About page and it will reference the proper server request through the API. So yeah, that's a really quick demo of the React packaging, or sorry, the Backbone packaging, JavaScript app packaging is what I mean to say, which will need to happen whenever you bundle any kind of JavaScript with your application, whether it's using Backbone or React or Angular or any other JavaScript framework that you're using for your application. So I put the link to the GitHub project down below in the description. Leave a comment in the video if you found this useful. If you had any issues getting this up and running and working, I'll be doing my best to try and help you out. And I really want to thank you for watching this video so far. I hope you enjoyed our little adventure into sort of legacy JavaScript applications with Backbone. But I had a lot of fun doing this, and I'm looking forward. I've got some other videos already written and just getting them queued up to work on right now. So have a great day wherever you are, and subscribe to this channel if you liked what you saw and you want to see more of it. Don't forget to like this video, and have a great day, everyone. Peace.